International Day of Peace today, and we are here today to discuss Afghanistan lessons, how to build lasting peace in a complex world. My name is Hanna Klinge and I will be moderating today's session. I serve as Deputy CEO and Chief Operations Officer at CMI, Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to listening and to commenting on today's discussion. In the wake of the 2-decade-long international crisis management operation, a lot of soul-searching is taking place at this moment within the international community, including the United States and their allies, the European Union, the peacemaking community globally, and of course the research community. And now that a few weeks have passed since the fall of Kabul, since the withdrawal of the international troops from Afghanistan, the dust is settling a little bit. And I think it's a good moment for reflections to especially learn on things that were done and to make sure perhaps that same mistakes will not be repeated in any other contexts. Despite these recent developments, we at CMI stick to our conviction, to our enduring vision that all conflicts can be resolved. In President Ahtisaari's words, what humans have started, humans can end. To that end, the experiences in Afghanistan will provide us with a great opportunity for reflection and to think how to find sustainable and better solutions to conflicts. And these solutions and better ways will be explored in today's discussion. This webinar is building on CMI's new publication called CMI Insight that captures some of the lessons learned by CMI's experts. The paper is shared in our chat box here today, but also through CMI's website and social media channels. So please feel free to look that up. This event is part of CMI's Peace Talks Live webinar series that seeks to inspire debate on what it takes to build lasting peace in the volatile world situation that we're at. Now turning to our speakers, we have great speakers with us today, starting with our own Janne Taalas, CEO of CMI, who has spent a quarter of a century in international diplomacy, specializing in multilateral diplomacy and in issues related to peace mediation. Especially relevant to note today is that he worked as the special envoy to the 2020 Afghanistan conference. Welcome, Janne. Then Dan Smith, director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, who has a long and varied track record in research on peace and conflict, especially focusing on the Middle East and Africa. And as he puts it on SIPRI website, he's got intimate knowledge on what works and what doesn't in the work of peace building, which is very relevant for today's conversation. Welcome very much, Dan Smith. And last but not least, Tyyne Karjalainen, research fellow from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, FIA, and her important research focuses on the European Union's foreign and security policy, as well as on questions around peace building, crisis management, and peace mediation. And before we hit off with our first round of comments and questions, a quick practical note. We're aiming to keep on listening to our panelists for the first 40 or 45 minutes and then leave 15 minutes for comments and questions from the audience at the end of this session. So you can use the chat box or just raise your hands at the end of the event when the time comes. And if you wish to tweet and discuss the content of this webinar on Twitter, please use the following hashtags. I believe this will be also shared at the chat box. Hashtag Peace Day, Afghanistan, and Peace Building. So with these words, welcome again, and we'll start the conversation with Janne. The conviction of CMI, all conflicts can be resolved. How does that apply to the Afghanistan conflict? It doesn't seem to be going that well. What are the key takeaways from the CMI's Insight paper? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Hanna. I hope you can hear me. It has been, for the CMI, we have had a very, very kind of deep analysis of what has happened in Afghanistan, because really it challenges our basic belief that all conflicts can be resolved. So this is either a proof that they cannot, or then we have done something wrong. And I think my main argument here is that, yes, we have done something wrong, and we have to look at the old conflicts can still be resolved, even Afghanistan. So, and it has been really useful to focus on our thinking. What I have, just 4 key takeaways, then I would add the 5th. The 4 are in the CMI reflection paper that you have, and it's no surprise that I will be kind of reciting them or making reference to them. But I think the first point is really that you cannot create sustainable peace by military means. It is striking that the most kind of conceptual, intellectual debate of Afghanistan in the last 20 years was about the level of troops. I remember the discussion of surges, how large the surge of US troops should be. That was the most kind of, I think, the highest level of debate that we had. And it's quite striking if you think it that way, that we really, it was a military strategy from the beginning to the end, and we stuck to it. And that's not the way to bring a peace. I think that's something what we have, we can say for sure now. Then the second point, and a corollary to the first, is really there was not an attempt in the 20 years to attempt a inclusive political process that would include all Afghans. First, of course, the West was not willing to engage some parts of the Afghan society, and towards the end, when the West was very strong, and towards the end, the Taliban were not interested, honestly, to engage into the discussion. So we missed many chances of inclusive political debate. And what I've said in other interviews is that the events of today, of the last few months, are yet again a possibility for an all-inclusive Afghan dialogue. That's the most positive outcome that could come out of this. It might not happen, but clearly there is a possibility right now that should be seized. But I think the fact is that that has not been tried. It's quite striking. It has not been tried. That's my second observation. That's our second key takeaway as a CMI. The third point is really kind of lack of coherence and cooperation among international actors. It was quite striking to look at the last stages of US negotiating with the Taliban, others kind of being kind of informed and non-informed, but clearly there was not coherent international strategy that would what is the political context of Afghanistan. There were issues were dealt in silos, be it an economic issue, humanitarian issue, development issue, and these were not brought together. I think the final point of our 4 key takeaways is something that regional actors were not leveraged. I think this also, it harks back to my third point of lack of international coherence, and that was most striking in the kind of regional context, that regional actors were not actively involved until very late. There has been improvement on that front in the last few years, but clearly that has been one issue that has contributed to failure. And this is something where we have laid out in our paper. I would add 5th, from my own perspective of kind of more economic nature, that we did create in Afghanistan a war economy. The massive international aid that was given was just created a absolutely weird, it just created corruption and crime and kind of maintained that. And I think that's something that you quite easily do in this kind of conflict-ridden societies, that the aid does not resolve problems, it actually accentuates and exacerbates the issues and really the clan structures and the crime and the corruption. But 4 takeaways from the CMI paper, and the 5th is kind of my own, coming from my last year's kind of negotiations on the economic assistance. But I would, that's in short. Over to you, Hanna.
Thank Thank you very much, Janne. We will then turn to Dan. How do you see all of this from the perspective of the international community? What are the key lessons for the international community in your view?
Number one key lesson is don't do it. Don't do it again. Go into a destroyed country and destroy it even more over 20 years. The one real achievement I can see during that period, maybe two taken from the counter-terror point of view. After all, Al-Qaeda was driven out of Afghanistan, but it's been active elsewhere, and international terrorism